Welcome to Sleepytime History. True stories from the pages of history for a full night's rest. If this is your first time listening, let us know where you're tuning in from, or make a request for a future episode. And if you like what you hear, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps us immensely. All right, it's time to settle in, relax, and take a wander through the pages of history and storytelling. Tonight, we're going to be exploring the remarkable true story of Hugh Glass, a frontiersman, fur trapper, and survivor of one of the most enduring tales of resilience in early American history. In the summer of 1823, Hugh Glass was part of a fur trading expedition along the upper Missouri River. These were the early days of westward exploration, when the boundaries of what was known remained vast and largely uncharted to European Americans. Glass was working with the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, deep in what is now the Dakota wilderness, a land of slow rivers, dense woods, and quiet, swaying grass. While scouting ahead near the Grand River, Glass was attacked by a grizzly bear. Though he managed to kill the animal with the help of his companions, he was left severely wounded, his body torn, bones broken, and survival uncertain. Believing he would not live long, the expedition's leader assigned 2 men to stay behind with him until he passed, then bury his body. But the men, one of them, a young Jim Bridger, later famous in his own right, soon abandoned him. They took his rifle, his knife, and what little gear he had left. They told the others he had died and moved on. Glass, however, did not die. Alone, unarmed, and badly injured, he began to crawl. Slowly and silently, he made his way through over 200 miles of wilderness. He encountered no rescue, no comfort, just the rhythm of the land and the quiet, patient strength it took to endure. Tonight, as we drift into sleep, we reflect not on the violence of that moment, but on the silence that followed it, on a man alone with his thoughts, inching his way across the plains with little more than his will to survive. So settle in, take a deep breath, and let's walk slowly through the great quiet wilderness of early America. Hugh Glass is believed to have been born around 1783, most likely in Pennsylvania, where the wooded hills met the restless edge of the expanding American frontier. He came into the world as the newly formed United States was still finding its shape, a land defined by shifting borders, new beginnings, and the slow settling of territories once held by indigenous nations. The details of his early life remain scarce, as if they were lost to the wind that moved through the forests of his youth. But what we do know tells us he came of age in a time when self-reliance and resilience were not romantic ideals. They were simply the price of survival. He was likely of Scots-Irish descent, descended from people who had known struggle, displacement, and the harsh demands of rural life. These were communities who lived by their hands, who watched the stars for weather, and the tree line for trouble. In the places where Hugh Glass grew up, life was close to the ground, filled with the hush of wooded trails, the flicker of cabin fires, and the long, quiet hours between planting and harvest. This was the environment that shaped him, not in loud moments, but in long silences. A boy may have learned to track a deer before he could read, or to listen more closely to the forest than to words. It's in this setting that Hugh Glass gained his first sense of the world. A world that required watchfulness, patience, and a steady hand. By his early adulthood, he was already marked by the frontier's rhythm, a life not quite tethered, always looking outward, and soon that pull would lead him away from the land altogether, drawn instead to the sea, where a new chapter of his journey would begin. After his years along the frontier, Hugh Glass turned his gaze outward, toward the wide, shifting waters of the coast. He became a sailor, boarding ships that carried goods along the eastern seaboard, into the Gulf of Mexico, and beyond. The sea was no gentler than the land he had known, but it offered a different kind of horizon, one that rolled endlessly under sky, full of wind and uncertainty. It was during this time, perhaps in his 20s or 30s, that Glass's story took one of its most extraordinary turns. While sailing in the Gulf, he was captured by pirates, reportedly under the command of the notorious privateer Jean Lafitte. Lafitte's base of operations near Galveston Island was a strange mix of outlaw commerce and colonial influence, a place where goods and lives were traded in the shadow of shifting empires. Glass was held as a prisoner, though the details of those months remain hazy. What's known is that he eventually escaped, slipping away from the coast and heading inland, into the uncertain interior of what is now modern-day Texas. There, he lived for a time among the Pawnee, one of the many indigenous peoples of the Great Plains. He did not simply pass through their world. He is believed to have lived among them, learning their ways, their language, and perhaps even forming bonds deep enough to consider them family. Some sources suggest he took a Pawnee wife, though these details are softly held, part memory, part oral tradition. What's clear is that these years left a deep mark. The knowledge he carried from that time, how to survive off the land, how to move silently across the plains, how to listen and observe, would one day save his life. By the early 1820s, Glass had re-entered the world of white settlers and trade. The American West was opening quickly now, driven by the hunt for furs and fortune. He joined the newly formed Rocky Mountain Fur Company, led by General William Ashley, as they prepared to push deep into territory that remained vast and untamed. Glass, now a man shaped by sea, captivity, and the patience of long survival, was ready. The next path he walked would lead him into the deep wilds, and into the story that would outlive him. By the spring of 1823, Hugh Glass was once again heading west, this time not as a lone wanderer, but as part of a formal expedition into the upper reaches of the Missouri River. He had joined the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, a bold new enterprise organized by General William Henry Ashley and Andrew Henry, who sought to tap the rich beaver streams of the frontier. The company had put out a call for enterprising young men, trappers and scouts willing to brave the vast unsettled country that lay beyond the Mississippi. Among those who answered were men who would become legendary in their own right: Jedediah Smith, Jim Bridger, Thomas Fitzpatrick, and others. Hugh Glass was older than many of them, weathered by years at sea and in the wilderness, but still strong, still quiet, and still drawn to the land's deep pull. Their goal was simple in words, but enormous in scale: travel by river and overland into the untrapped regions of the upper Missouri, following its branching waterways into what is now North and South Dakota, Montana, and beyond. It was a land of rich game, dense forests, and winding rivers, but also one of tension and danger, as settlers and trading companies pushed further into indigenous territories, often with little thought for those who already lived there. The journey began near St. Louis with a flotilla of shallow draft boats known as keelboats, loaded with supplies and men. They moved slowly against the current, poling, rowing, and sometimes wading alongside to guide the vessels forward. The air was warm with spring and damp with the scent of wet wood and river silt. Trees leaned quietly over the banks. Birds called from high branches, and always the water moved, steady, soft, and endless. As the expedition progressed into the Dakota Territory, tensions with local tribes began to rise. Though the fur traders often dealt peacefully with indigenous peoples, not all interactions were welcomed. In one encounter outside a Native American village, a skirmish broke out that left several men dead. But the company pushed on, now wary, moving by land where they could. This was the world Glass had returned to, one of shifting alliances, uncertain borders, and the quiet hum of danger just beyond the tree line. But to men like him, it was also familiar. The open spaces, the hush of pine groves at dusk, the crunch of dried leaves underfoot. All of it spoke of a life he understood. Not civilized, perhaps, but clear in its demands. The wilderness did not lie. It asked only for patience, awareness, and the will to keep moving. Glass served as a scout, often traveling ahead of the main group to read the land and watch for signs of game or threat. He was quiet, observant, and experienced, the kind of man others followed with trust, even if they knew little about where he had come from. His past was his own. What mattered now was his place in the present, a man of the trail, moving through silence and shadow with the ease of long memory. The days passed slowly. Nights came with the crackle of small fires and the murmur of river water nearby. Overhead, stars wheeled gently through the sky, as they had for centuries before. The men slept on the ground, wrapped in blankets, their rifles close. And in the quiet before dawn, Hugh Glass would often be up first, watching, listening, and reading the world around him. It was in this setting, deep in the wild, far from any settlement, that the moment would come, which would define his story forever. But for now, the land remained patient, and the river kept flowing. The summer of 1823 found the Rocky Mountain Fur Company deep in the Grand River Valley, in what is now South Dakota. The land was wild and open, a place of tall grass, scattered timber, and soft hills that rolled like waves beneath the sky. Wildlife was plentiful, but so were risks, not just from the terrain or weather, but from the sheer remoteness of it all. Hugh Glass had taken on the role of scout for the expedition. It was his task to move ahead of the main party, sometimes miles ahead, to watch for danger and track game. He knew how to read broken branches, quiet prints in the mud, the subtle hush of birds changing flight. His years among the Pawnee and his time in the wilderness had made him an expert in the kind of awareness that kept a man alive. On a quiet afternoon, the exact day lost to time, Glass was alone, scouting ahead in the woods near the fork of a small creek. The air was still. The sun filtered gently through the trees, and somewhere in the underbrush, a grizzly bear stirred. She was not hunting. She was guarding, her cubs nearby, likely startled by Glass's presence. What happened next came swiftly. Grizzlies do not often give warning, and they do not hesitate when they believe their young are threatened. Glass was attacked with overwhelming force. The bear's strength was immense, her claws tearing, her weight crushing. But Glass fought back. He carried a flintlock rifle and a knife, and though he was gravely injured, he managed to wound the bear. His cries brought fellow trappers running, and together they finished the animal off. But by the time the danger had passed, Glass lay unmoving, his body broken and torn. He was still breathing, barely. His leg was shattered, his back deeply lacerated, and his throat and face torn to the point where speaking was difficult. The men gathered around him believed his death was a matter of hours, perhaps days. He was too injured to carry, and the expedition, already low on supplies, could not afford to stay in place for long. The company's leaders faced a hard decision. They resolved to leave two men behind, one older and experienced, John Fitzgerald, and one younger, barely into manhood, Jim Bridger, who would later become a legend in his own right. Their task was to remain with Glass until he passed, bury him with dignity, and then catch up with the rest. The rest of the party moved on. Fitzgerald and Bridger stayed, watching over a man who no longer spoke and barely moved. Days passed. Perhaps the nights were quiet, the air still. Perhaps they listened to Glass breathe, slow and shallow, wondering how long he would last. But soon, whether out of fear, impatience, or self-preservation, they made their choice. They took his rifle, his knife, and his supplies. They dug a shallow grave and left him for dead. Not out of cruelty, perhaps, but out of certainty. A man in that state, alone in that place, could not survive. They rejoined the company and reported that Hugh Glass had died as expected. But Glass had not died, not yet. The wind moved softly through the grass. In the shadow of a half-dug grave, with a broken leg, torn flesh, and no weapons or tools, Hugh Glass opened his eyes. He was alone. His breath came shallowly, and his body was barely more than pain. The bear had done its work, tearing into his back, breaking his leg, clawing his throat. Speaking was impossible, moving nearly so. But even through the fog of agony and fever, some part of him understood. He had been left behind. The wilderness around him gave no judgment. It simply existed, wide, quiet, and indifferent. The trees stood still. The birds resumed their calls. The creek ran on, its rhythm unchanged. If Glass was to survive, it would not be by fighting the land, but by becoming part of it, slow, deliberate, and patient. He began, inch by inch, to crawl. There was no grand gesture to it, no cry of defiance, just movement, slow, silent, and enduring. His left leg was useless. He dragged it behind him as he pulled himself forward with his arms and one working knee. Every root, every stone, every uneven patch of ground became an obstacle. And still, he moved. For food, he foraged what he could. berries, roots, and the occasional insect. Water came from streams or dew gathered on leaves. At one point, he allowed maggots to enter the open wounds on his back, knowing they would clean the dead flesh better than he could. This was not the work of pride or even courage. It was the quiet calculation of someone who had lived close to the edge before and now moved beyond it. The landscape became his world and his only companion. He followed the rivers, knowing they led south toward the Cheyenne River, and eventually to the trading post at Fort Kiowa. There were no paths, no signs, only memory, instinct, and the slow pull of gravity as he dragged himself forward. Days passed, perhaps weeks. Time lost its shape. The stars wheeled overhead. The sun rose and fell, casting long shadows across the prairie. Glass made no speeches, no plans, only quiet, constant motion. This was not a survival story made of battle or fury. It was a survival made of endurance, of stillness between moments, and of a man refusing to stop, even as every breath carried pain. At times, he encountered indigenous people. One group of friendly Dakota is said to have offered him aid, sewing a buffalo hide across his wounded back, giving him food, and pointing him on his way. They asked no questions, and he offered no words. He simply kept moving, further south, ever closer to the river, and whatever waited beyond it. And the land, vast, open, and ancient, watched him go, not cheering him on, not standing in his way, just being as it always had and always would. The land had begun to change. The grasses grew taller here, waving softly in the breeze, and the banks of the Cheyenne River rolled in long, gentle curves. The trees thinned in places, opening to wide sky and soft sun, as if the land itself were breathing more easily now. But Hugh Glass did not walk these places. He crawled. The days blurred into one another, each marked only by small victories, a stretch of shade, a trickle of water, a patch of berries not yet picked over by animals. His broken leg he kept stiff, dragging it across rocks and soil, while his arms, trembling but determined, bore his weight across miles of uneven ground. He followed the river south toward Fort Kiowa, a trading post hundreds of miles away. It offered no promise, no guarantee, just a direction, and that, for now, was enough. Sometimes he would find driftwood or branches and use them to make a crude splint, wrapping his leg as best he could with strips of hide or cloth torn from what little remained of his clothing. He had no rifle, no knife, only his memory, his will, and the faint trail left by the flowing river. There were nights when he lay still, barely breathing, listening to the far-off calls of animals in the dark. The wilderness was not quiet, not truly. It spoke in creaks and rustles, in distant howls and the slow lap of water against stone. But it was a kind of honest noise, one that asked nothing of him and offered no comfort in return. He passed through wolf territory, and once, it said, he came across a pack feeding on a bison carcass. Hungry, exhausted, but too weak to drive them off, Glass waited nearby. When the wolves had their fill and moved on, he dragged himself to what remained, pulling strips of meat from the frozen hide with his bare hands. It was not clean or easy, but it was food, and it kept him alive. He moved through rain, through wind, through stretches of silence so long they seemed to fold time itself. At one point, he may have found a makeshift raft, lashed together from fallen branches, and floated briefly along the Cheyenne River, letting the current carry him forward, cradled by the water, the sky stretching endlessly above. Not all of his journey is documented in detail. Much of it remains a blur of hardship and slow, steady motion. But what endures is the rhythm, a man inching his way back from death, not by rage or force, but by quiet refusal. Refusal to stop, refusal to surrender, refusal to let the land forget him entirely. After nearly 6 weeks, he reached the edges of Fort Kiowa, thin, ragged, and skeletal, but alive. The men who saw him arrive may have stared in disbelief. Few could have imagined his survival. Fewer still could understand what it had taken to get there. But Hugh Glass didn't need them to understand. He had made it. And now, slowly, the world would return. When Hugh Glass arrived at Fort Kiowa, his body bore the marks of a journey most could scarcely imagine. The wounds across his back had begun to scar in thick ridges. His leg, still swollen and poorly mended, dragged behind him with each unsteady step. His face, torn and unshaven, carried the exhaustion of weeks spent between pain and resolve. But he was alive. Fort Kiowa sat on the banks of the Missouri River, a wooden outpost built for trade, stocked with goods, rifles, food, and the low hum of frontier life. For Glass, it must have seemed almost surreal, after so many days spent alone in the elements. Voices again, the scent of cooked food, smoke curling gently from chimneys. It was the first time in weeks he had seen more than trees and sky. The men at the fort treated him with a mixture of wonder and caution, the kind of reverence reserved for someone who has walked back from a place most never return from. He was tended to, fed, and slowly nursed back to a measure of strength. His wounds would never fully heal, but over time he recovered enough to walk, enough to speak, enough to tell the story of what had happened. And when he spoke, the names came easily. John Fitzgerald, Jim Bridger, the 2 men who had left him for dead. They had taken his rifle, his knife, and his hope of rescue. And while Bridger was young, perhaps still a teenager, Fitzgerald had made a choice, one that, to Glass, could not be left unspoken. But his return was not filled with fire or fury. There were no angry declarations, no wild oaths, just quiet intent, a need, perhaps, not for revenge, but for acknowledgement, to face those who had written him off, to remind them and the world that he was still here. He learned that the fur company had moved on toward the Yellowstone region, and that both Fitzgerald and Bridger were still alive. With limited supplies and the help of nearby trappers, Glass set out once again. This time not as a scout, but as a man following footsteps. The journey was not easy. Though he could move more freely now, he was still weakened. The terrain remained vast and unpredictable, but compared to what he had already endured, this leg of the journey must have seemed almost gentle. A return to familiar paths, the ground firmer beneath his feet. Along the way, he reconnected with others, from the original expedition. Word of his survival began to spread, a whisper that turned into a story, then into a legend. Trappers and traders alike passed it from camp to camp, scarcely believing it, yet holding fast to its truth. The man who crawled from death, the man the wilderness could not claim. But Hugh Glass didn't speak of legend. He spoke of Fitzgerald, of a rifle taken, of trust broken. And slowly, step by step, he drew closer to the final part of his journey, the moment of return, not just to the world of men, but to the two who had once stood at his side and then walked away. Hugh Glass had survived the bear, the abandonment, and the long crawl through wilderness. He had returned to the world of men, not only with his body intact, but with a memory sharpened by pain and a name fixed firmly in his mind. John Fitzgerald. But before he found Fitzgerald, there was someone else, Jim Bridger, the younger of the two who had left him behind. When Glass caught up with Bridger, he found not a hardened enemy, but a boy barely grown, quiet and guilt-ridden. Bridger had been about 19 years old at the time of the attack. Many sources suggest he had acted under Fitzgerald's influence, fearful and uncertain, and not yet shaped by the strength of his own judgment. When Glass confronted him, it wasn't with anger, but with understanding, perhaps even pity. He let Bridger go. There was no shouting, no punishment, just the quiet weight of a choice made, and the consequence of having lived with it. Bridger, of course, would go on to become one of the most respected mountain men of his time. But he would always carry the memory of that season, of the man they had buried too soon. As for Fitzgerald, the confrontation was more complex. Glass eventually tracked him to a U.S. Army post where Fitzgerald had enlisted. By this time, Glass had regained some strength, perhaps even recovered his rifle, or one like it. The story of his survival had grown in the telling. And so had the anticipation of what he might do when he found the man who had taken everything from him. But when he arrived at the post and found Fitzgerald, Glass faced a boundary even deeper than betrayal, the law. Fitzgerald was now a soldier in the U.S. Army, and under military regulation, Glass could not legally harm a serving member of the armed forces without consequence, regardless of what had passed between them. So, once again, he made a choice. He did not kill him. He confronted him, yes, demanded the return of his stolen rifle, and gave him a full measure of his silent condemnation. But he did not take vengeance, whether it was restraint, legality, or something deeper. The man who had crawled hundreds of miles to survive walked away. In the world of frontier legend, this moment often becomes blurred. Some retellings add anger and threats, or claim the confrontation ended differently. But the clearest records we have say this: Hugh Glass did not seek revenge. He sought resolution. And when the moment came, he did not raise his hand. He simply looked, spoke, and turned back to the trail. It was perhaps the most powerful decision he made. A man who had every reason to lash out chose instead to keep moving forward. Not because he had to, but because he had already endured more than any man should. And in that choice, Glass became something more than a survivor. He became a symbol, not of rage, but of resilience. Long after the wounds had healed and the trail had faded behind him, Hugh Glass's story began to travel on its own. In fur trading camps, around fires under open skies, and in distant towns where trappers gathered to barter goods, his name was spoken with quiet reverence. The man who had faced down a grizzly and crawled over 200 miles with nothing but his will. That story was passed from voice to voice, growing with each telling. But even as the legend expanded, the real Glass returned to a quieter life. He went back to the wilderness, not as a hero, but as a trapper once more. He joined further expeditions, traveled with companies that knew the sharp edge of the frontier, and continued to live by the skills that had kept him alive before the bear and after. There was no book contract, no audience, just the familiar rhythm of open country and the call of rivers and forests. Still, the story could not be contained. In 1825, just 2 years after his crawl to Fort Kiowa, a version of Glass's ordeal appeared in print, a stylized account written by James Hall, published in a popular frontier magazine. From there, the tale took on a life of its own. Details were sharpened or softened. Some versions told of revenge carried out. Others added drama, dialogue, or danger not found in the original accounts. Glass became a symbol of rugged American perseverance, a man whose body had been broken, but whose spirit refused to yield. Over the decades, as the frontier myth grew, his name appeared in ballads, novels, and campfire tales. Each retelling polished the story like a stone in a river, smoothing some edges, exaggerating others, and slowly turning man into myth. He wasn't famous in his lifetime, not in the way modern fame understands it, but among those who knew the wild, the fur trappers, the scouts, the early explorers, his name lingered. And even now, nearly 2 centuries later, the story of Hugh Glass still finds its way into the quiet corners of our memory, not as a tale of revenge or conquest, but as a soft, steady reminder of what a human being can survive when all that remains is the will to take the next breath, and then the next. Glass did not vanish after his famous crawl. He did not retire into comfort or step into the pages of history as a man finished with hardship. Instead, he returned to what he had always known: the wilderness, the rivers, the open country that shaped him. For the rest of his life, he continued to trap and trade along the frontier. He roamed through what are now the Dakotas, Montana, and Wyoming, walking familiar trails and forging new ones, his name quietly respected by those who shared that rough and changing world. He was not a man drawn to cities or to talk of what he had done. There is no record of him seeking fame or telling his story for applause. He seemed content to remain as he had been, watchful, quiet, and deeply connected to the land beneath his feet. In the year 1833, roughly a decade after the grizzly attack, Hugh Glass met his end, not in solitude, but in an ambush. He was traveling near the Yellowstone River, likely with a small party of trappers, when he was killed in a confrontation with Arikara warriors, a group with whom tensions had remained high since earlier expeditions. He was around 50 years old. His body, as far as we know, was not recovered. His grave, if one was ever made, lies somewhere unknown, perhaps by a riverbank, or beneath a canopy of cottonwood trees, or perhaps, as the legends sometimes suggest, the wilderness simply took him back. But the story he left behind remained. Not just the crawl, not just the bear, but something deeper, the idea that a man, broken and alone, could rise again, not with fury, but with quiet, unshakable purpose. Hugh Glass became a part of the landscape he had traveled, spoken of in the hush of campfire tales, remembered by scouts and storytellers alike. And over the generations, his name moved outward, beyond the frontier, into books, into song, into the corners of history that still echo with footsteps through tall grass and quiet woods. The world is often loud, but Glass's story reminds us that some of the greatest acts of courage are done in silence, in pain, and in the soft rhythm of a soul that simply keeps going. And so, as we close our eyes tonight, we remember Hugh Glass, not for what he conquered, but for what he endured, and for how deeply he reminds us of what it means to survive. That's all for tonight's journey through history. Whether you're fast asleep or still drifting there, thank you for listening. Until next time, rest well.